Hello everyone, we have recently learned of the tragic passing of the very young Grandmaster, 29-year-old Daniel Naroditsky. So I am not going to talk with you about the causes of his death. I prefer to focus on what I know how to do, which is sharing knowledge, but also highlighting the strategies of these great champions. And regarding Daniel Naroditsky, you should know that there was a quote from him that I found very relevant. It was already a few years ago, and I always thought I would share it with you in one of my videos. And I never did. I don't know why. Yet this quote really seemed relevant to me in relation to my audience, that is, you, passionate chess players, and I never shared it. So this is the opportunity, through this game by Daniel Naroditsky that I selected for you, to reveal this quote to you. All right, let's take a look at this game. So Daniel Naroditsky is facing an Indian grandmaster named Kanapan Priyadarshan. I hope I didn't mispronounce his name. It's not easy to say. And so Daniel Naroditsky has the white pieces. The game starts with d4. It's going to be an interesting game, positionally, strategically, but also tactically. His opponent replies symmetrically with the pawn to d5, and now bishop to f4. This move is typical of the London system. You know, you bring out the bishop before playing the e3 and c3 pawns to create that pyramid structure. It's very defensive on the dark squares, with the bishop developed, so it's not stuck on c1 behind its pawn structure. The opponent replies with c5. That's a move I use myself with black, this push of the pawn to c5. And very often white continues with e3, which is not what will happen here. Daniel Naroditsky. When white continues with e3, I like to exchange with black to provoke the Carlsbad pawn structure. A pawn structure where the two sides will confront each other. The strategic elements of the semi-open c-file for black against the semi-open e-file for white. The outpost on d5 favors white, while the central majority favors black. So this structure is very rich, strategically speaking. But that's not the case in this video, because in this position, Daniel Naroditsky is going to play a rather rare move, one that is very seldom played by amateur players online in playing zones. He's going to take on c5, so he accepts the deflection of his pawn. So black responds with e6, which seems normal. It frees the dark squared bishop to recapture the pawn, c5 to take advantage of their central pawn on d5. But then why did he do that? Daniel Naroditsky, well, quite simply, he knows that he has to concede the central d5 pawn to his opponent, but he is going to attack it right away. He will react dynamically in the center by pushing e4, with the idea that if black takes on e4, the file opens up. So you can exchange queens, uncastle the black king, play knight to c3 to attack the e4 pawn, and prepare a future long castle with check against the black king. This gives a very good position for white, so this e4 push is interesting to attack the d5 pawn. How will the Indian Grandmaster respond? He plays knight to f6, protecting d5. He renews the threats against the d4 pawn, and the bishop is still ready to take the c5 pawn. So there is an exchange, then we take on d5. The knight recaptures, attacking the bishop, which retreats to g3. Then the bishop takes on c5 for black. And here, you could say that black has a nice advantage. We've only played 6 moves so far, and black has developed 2 pieces versus 1. They can castle very easily, whereas white in the end is still far from being able to castle. So what is the imbalance that could be interesting for Daniel Naroditsky in this position? We need to look at the structural imbalance. Black has 4 pawns versus 3 on the right side of the board, on the king side. This could help black, by the way, in their intention to attack white's castling position if white castles short. But on the other side of the board, Daniel Naroditsky. He has 3 pawns against 2, so a majority on the queen side, a majority of distant pawns. And often, such majorities can advance more easily than a kingside majority when trying to create a passed pawn. So we might see moves like a 3, then b4 to push back the bishop, c4 to drive away the knight, then c5, b5, and maybe at some point the move c6 to create a passed pawn. So white's play is of course based on development. You need to catch up in development and then mobilize the queenside pawn majority to try to gain space and create a passed pawn, all while keeping firm control over the e5 square so that black has a hard time playing the pawn to e5, and so that this pawn can't be used in a future attack against the white king after he castles short. White plays knight to d2, castles kingside, and as you can see, knight to f3. The knight and the bishop will take care of controlling the e5 square. Why did the knight go to d2, so as not to block the c2 pawn? The idea is to allow the c2 pawn to move so that the majority of 3 pawns against 2 can become active as the game goes on. Black plays b6 bishop to d3, And here it's an interesting moment because black could have simply settled for bishop to b7, placing their bishop on the long white diagonal, but they prefer to play bishop to a6. But bishop to a6 will provoke an exchange of pieces. Now, the fewer there are pieces on the board and the more, it's easy to mobilize a distant pawn majority, especially in endgames. So in this position, Daniel Naroditsky doesn't fear the exchange. He takes on a6. Now she plays queen to e2 to attack the knight. Black plays queen to c8 to defend it. Pawn to a3, which prevents the knight from going to b4 and even the other one, and even the bishop. So this controls the b4 square and prepares the b4 push, followed by the c4 push. So to activate this pawn majority on the queen side, black anticipates the b4 push and plays bishop to e7. c4 is played, the knight is pushed back to f6, then b4. And we see that the three pawns have now reached the frontier. The pawns on b4 and c4 are at the frontier. Queen to b7 is played. Black has connected their rooks, so they've completed their development first, but white castles short as well. Rook to d8, the rook takes its place on the file, and here white plays rook to b1. So this move might seem a bit mysterious because the pawn on b4, which is under attack, was already defended by the pawn on a3. But Daniel Naroditsky's idea is to be able to play c5. And in case of a capture, why not recapture with the pawn so that the rook can attack the queen? Black plays h6. The knight comes to f5, taking up the outpost. He approaches black's foundations, notably by putting pressure on the pawn at f7 and controlling the important squares c6 and d7. Black plays rook to c8. Black's play is well organized. Apart from the knight on a6, which is offside, the rest of black's pieces are rather well positioned. And now, the c5 push. And this is where we see the value of the rook and queen facing each other. Because if black takes, we recapture with the pawn. The queen is attacked by the discovered attack from the rook, and our white queen attacks the black knight. So if black moves the queen, they lose their knight, because there really isn't a square for the black queen to keep protecting the knight. The white knight, by the way, controls the c6 square, so the black queen can't go there. That's why after this c5 push, the Indian Grandmaster doesn't capture. He retreats his knight to b8, looking to reposition it, because in any case, the knight on a6 was badly placed. Knight from d to c4. And we can see how the white knights are gaining ground. The knight on e5, the knight from b1, which had developed rather slowly to d2, now rises again with this move, knight to c4. Black captures on c5, and now we're going to take a pause. We're going to take a short pause. Why? Because this is a critical moment. One might expect white to recapture on c5, still attacking the queen, but then it would be necessary to ensure the protection of the c5 pawn, which is targeted by the bishop and the rook. And if the goal of having a majority is to create a passed pawn, you have to avoid losing the passed pawn immediately after creating it. So in this position, Daniel Naroditsky is not going to take the pawn on c5. He's going to counter-push with b5, leaving black with an extra pawn. And yet his idea is brilliant. And this is where I can come back to one of those quotes. You know, the quote I was never able to give you in previous videos, or the one I forgot to give you. Daniel Naroditsky, what does he say? He says that most amateur players or beginners don't understand the sacrifice unless it's to deliver checkmate or to immediately recover the material after a rather forceful sequence of moves. But he also says that the strongest players, that grandmasters, can envision sacrifices with deeper purposes, with compensations such as, for example, better development or a better pawn structure. And in this position, the white pawn structure is interesting because the pawn on c5 is an extra pawn for black. It's a passed pawn, but it is properly blocked by the presence of the knight on c4, which is itself well supported and can be further supported by the rooks. And the pawn on c5 hinders the bishop's play and also blocks the rook's activity. And by preserving the b pawn, because Daniel Naroditsky didn't exchange on c5 but pushed instead, he deprives the black knight of the a6 and c6 squares. In fact, of course, he deprives the black knight of the c6 square, where it could have tried to return in order to try to dislodge. By the way, the knight on e5. So one might think that the knight from b8 could develop to d7. But in that case, the white knight could use the c6 square, protected by the b5 pawn. So what I'm telling you is that in this position, even though black has an extra pawn, ultimately the c5 pawn blocks the play of the black pieces, while the b5 pawn improves the play of the white pieces. And then white still has a majority. Certainly, they had a 3-2 majority on the queen side. And here, if we do a material count, it's 2 pawns against 2. But there is still a localized majority. That is, the a3 and b5 pawns form a small majority against the a7 pawn. So there is always the hope of advancing the pawns to create an advanced passed pawn. So this is a very interesting strategic concept in this position from Daniel Naroditsky. And really not obvious at all. This is the kind of move a grandmaster makes. It might not be a brilliant move with a sacrifice. By the way, we will see some brilliant moves in this game, but maybe not right now. A brilliant move, a tactical fireworks display. But it's these small moves like this that undermine the opponent's play. So the Indian Grandmaster plays queen to e4, he's a pawn up, and he's looking to exchange queens. Of course, white will refuse this queen exchange and moves to a2. What an interesting square at 2. One might think, yes, the queen moved to avoid the queen exchange, to support the advance of the two pawns on the a and b files, or perhaps also to defend. The knight on c4, so it overprotects the knight on c4, which is the knight blocking the black's passed pawn. That's true, by the way. But there's another idea behind queen to a2, a tactical idea that Daniel Naroditsky already had in mind. He had already planned his upcoming combination. There's a queen-king alignment. So you might say, yes, that alignment is there, but there are a lot of pieces in between, the knight and the two pawns. But sometimes the pieces in between can disappear as a result of exchanges, captures, sacrifices, or deflections. And that's what's about to happen. And when you see such alignments, well, you should always take them into account. Now, sometimes with these alignments, you won't be able to get anything out of them. And sometimes they'll be decisive. The influence of a piece doesn't stop at the first piece it encounters. That is, the queen's influence doesn't end at the presence of the knight, nor even at the presence of the black pawn. You really have to look all the way to the end. And Daniel Naroditsky is going to give us a lesson in tactics regarding these alignments. Because here black plays knight to h5, the knight goes after the bishop and black frees up. The f6 square, maybe for their bishop, maybe for their pawn, I don't know yet, but there's this move, knight to h5, that's played. And now, Daniel Naroditsky makes his combination. Knight takes on f7. Black is forced to recapture, otherwise they've just lost a very important pawn for nothing in the end. So they take back. The second knight launches an assault on the d5 square, checking the king. And now the Indian Grandmaster is going to come to f6. Because if the king moves back, that will allow the white queen to take the pawn on e6 and join forces with the knight to continue the attack. So in the game, the Indian Grandmaster plays king f6, staying to protect the pawn on e6. What follows is very beautiful, very instructive. Because when attacking the king, you might think that the queen is involved, the knight and the bishop, maybe even the rooks. But believe it or not, the pawns on f2, g2 and h2 can also, at some point, play a role in the attack. In reality, in this position, only the pawns on a3 and b5 are not directly involved in the immediate attack on the black king. But what we're about to see is magnificent, because here, Daniel Naroditsky is down a piece, but he's targeting the safety of the black king. The black king has no shelter. You know, in chess, that's the most decisive thing. How many games have you played where you had extra pieces but still got checkmated? Everyone knows this. Everyone knows that the king's safety is the most important criterion in chess. And we're going to see how Daniel Naroditsky will play here against the weakness of the black king. He starts with rook b to e1. You might think that the rook on b1 was already active, and it would have been better to bring out the other rook. But no, in reality, he's right to play the rook from b1 to e1. He wants to keep the rook on f1 lined up with the black king. You might say, but there's the pawn on f2 blocking it. But that's exactly the point. It prevents black from capturing on g3 at any moment in the game. Because if the f-pawn is recaptured, the rook would immediately become involved. So this removes some defensive options for black. In this position, the queen moves to f5. Now, if black had played queen to d5 to offer a queen exchange, I suppose white could have played queen to b1 or queen to c2, trying to get into g6, threatening mate, which would have almost forced black to sacrifice their queen for the knight. We could also consider queen to e2. The black king is quite alone, and we are attacking the knight. You see, if knight takes, then pawn recaptures, which frees the rook and attacks the king. And after king to g5, h4 is checkmate, the pawn mate. So we understand from the position that black doesn't want to go to d5. They don't want to give up control of that diagonal. So queen to f5 is played. But bishop to h4 is check, and the king is running out of squares. Fortunately for black, there's still the push to g5. But now, Daniel Naroditsky is going to bring the g-pawn into play. We saw that the f-pawn could be involved, sometimes with the bishop on g3. After knight takes, we could recapture with the pawn. We saw that the h2 pawn could be involved as well. We even saw a mate with the advance of the h2 pawn to h4. And now it's the g pawn, g4, which attacks the queen. So the queen shifts to f4, the bishop returns to g3, and after knight takes, it's the pawn that recaptures, opening the file, and the black queen is trapped, it's pinned. So black plays queen to d2. He offers a queen exchange with the rook, which defends the queen and attacks the white queen. White could very well exchange queens and then win the knight afterwards. But Daniel Naroditsky wants more. He wants to triumph in this game with a checkmate, and he plays queen to b1. In fact, he did everything so that the black queen would stop watching over the diagonal. And now there's a threat. Queen to g6 mate. Rook to g8 was played. And Daniel Naroditsky finishes the game with queen to h7. The opponent resigns. Because the threat is terrible. White is threatening. Queen to f7 mate. But they have another mate. It's queen to f6. For example, if black plays rook to f8 to control the f7 square, what do you do? Queen to f6 check. And after rook to g6, queen takes g6 checkmate. What a beautiful game by Daniel Naroditsky. I don't know what you think about it. Feel free to pay tribute to him in the comments, sharing your appreciation for the beauty of his play or any little anecdotes you have about him, while staying focused on the positive aspects of the player. So don't hesitate to leave me your comments, give a thumbs up, share the video, and support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.